The cold bit at Aiden's skin like the sharpest knives, a harsh reminder that the wilderness he had come to love could turn against him in an instant. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decay and something far darker, a hunger that clawed at the edges of his mind. Aiden had been hiking for hours, well beyond the point of his planned route, but the promise of untouched land had lured him deeper into the frozen wilderness. He had heard the stories, of course, the warnings from locals back home, the murmurs in the bars, the old legends passed down through generations. They spoke of a creature born from starvation and greed, a beast that haunted the forests, devouring those unfortunate enough to cross its path. But Aiden, practical and level-headed, dismissed them as just that, stories. What harm could a few tales from the old world do in this modern age? Yet as the sky darkened and the forest closed in around him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something patient, something hungry. He had been hiking alone for days, escaping the monotony of city life and seeking solace in the quiet of nature. The crisp, cold air, the crackling of pine needles underfoot, and the silence that only wilderness could provide. It was all he needed. But now, that same silence felt suffocating, as though the forest itself had turned its back on him. Aiden glanced around, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The towering pines were eerily still, their branches heavy with snow, casting long shadows on the ground. The only sound was the crunch of his boots in the snow and the distant howl of wolves. Or was it wolves? He stopped dead in his tracks, his heart skipping a beat. The howl wasn't quite right. It was too deep, too guttural. A tremor ran down his spine, but he shook it off. Wolves. It had to be wolves. He had encountered packs before, nothing to worry about. But then he heard it again. A distant, raspy noise, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. He couldn't quite make out the words, but the voice had a chilling quality to it, as if it was calling to him. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he pressed on, driven by a mix of curiosity and stubbornness. The trail ahead grew steeper, and the trees seemed to crowd in tighter. Aiden's pace slowed as he navigated the thick snow, the wind biting at his face with every step. His mind wandered, thinking of his brother, Tom, who had warned him not to venture this far. "You'll get lost out there, Aiden. The woods don't forgive." But Aiden hadn't listened. Tom had always been the cautious one. And now, standing in the heart of the wilderness, Aiden couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden rustling in the snow behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Nothing. The forest was silent again. But the unease lingered, crawling under his skin like 1,000 tiny insects. Aiden quickened his pace, but the sound of footsteps in the snow seemed to follow him, echoing from just out of sight. His breath came faster now, and his fingers gripped the handle of his backpack, knuckles white from the tension. He was imagining things, that's all. It had to be. The trees around him seemed to shift as he moved, their dark shapes bending and swaying in the wind, casting strange shadows that danced across the snow. Aiden stumbled on a patch of ice, his foot slipping, and he fell to the ground with a grunt. For a moment, he lay there, staring up at the sky, trying to steady his breath. As he got back to his feet, he noticed something strange, something that made his blood run cold. The snow wasn't just disturbed around him. It had been disturbed for miles. Tracks, large, elongated prints, not quite human, but too symmetrical to belong to any animal he knew. They were deep in the snow, as if something incredibly heavy had passed through, and they led off the trail, far off. Aiden's breath hitched in his throat. He stood frozen, staring at the tracks, his mind racing. There was no way he was going to follow them. No way. But his legs seemed to betray him, carrying him toward the mysterious path in spite of his every instinct to turn back. The shadows seemed to grow darker as he stepped deeper into the unknown, and with each step, the air grew colder. The howl he had heard earlier echoed again, closer now, more distinct. But this time, there was a terrifying new sound. A low, rasping breath that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Aiden's pulse quickened. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He wasn't alone. The creature was out there, watching, waiting. Its hunger, ancient and insatiable, was drawing closer, like a predator to its prey. And then, through the trees he saw it. A shadow, tall and thin, standing unnaturally still against the snow. Its form was indistinct, almost blending into the darkness of the woods. But its eyes, those eyes, glowed with an unnatural, unsettling light. A deep, burning hunger. Aiden's blood ran cold. He tried to move, but his legs felt like stone. The creature's gaze pierced through him, locking him in place as it slowly began to step toward him. Its long limbs extending in jerky, unnatural motions. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He had heard the legends. He had heard of the Wendigo, its insatiable hunger, its monstrous form, and its ability to track its prey across vast distances, no matter how fast they ran. And now here it was, coming for him. Aiden's breath caught in his throat as the Wendigo's mouth parted, revealing sharp, jagged teeth stained with the blood of those who had come before. He stumbled back, his foot slipping again, but this time he didn't fall. He ran. He ran with everything he had, his breath ragged and his heart hammering in his chest. The sound of the Wendigo's pursuit was deafening, the crunch of its feet on the snow echoing through the forest, getting closer with every passing second. But as Aiden pushed himself forward, the ground beneath him gave way, and he fell. With a scream, he tumbled into the darkness, the world around him spinning as he plunged deeper into the earth, the Wendigo's hungry growl ringing in his ears. The last thing he saw before everything went black were those glowing eyes, staring, watching, waiting. Aiden's mind was a blur when he finally came to. The first thing he noticed was the cold, the kind of cold that seemed to seep into your very bones, making you feel as though you might never warm again. He was lying on his back, staring up at a ceiling of rock. His head throbbed from the fall, and his body felt bruised all over, as though he had been dragged through the wilderness itself. He tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through his leg. He winced and forced himself to sit up, his vision spinning. The light from the small, dim opening above him barely reached the ground, casting the area in a strange, ghostly glow. Aiden blinked, trying to clear his vision, but all he could see was a dark tunnel. A cave, he realized. Where am I? His voice was weak, barely a whisper. The fall had been deeper than he had imagined. The edge of the tunnel above him was too far out of reach to climb back up. He was stuck, trapped. Panic gripped him, and for a moment he forgot all about the creature. He felt an overwhelming urge to get out of this place, to run back to the surface, to find the safety of the open forest. But as he tried to get up, the pain in his leg flared again, and he collapsed back to the cold stone floor. His fingers scraped across the rough surface as he tried to steady himself, and that's when he noticed something else. The ground was covered with remnants, broken bits of bone, torn clothing, and blood-stained scraps of fabric. It was as if this cave had been a graveyard for those who had fallen before him. A deep, terrible realization sank in. He wasn't alone down here, not only in this cave but in the forest as well. He had heard stories of the Wendigo, of its hunger, of its terrifying pursuit of anyone foolish enough to wander into its domain. But hearing stories and experiencing it were two completely different things. He was truly alone. and the Wendigo was out there hunting. Aiden took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the air was thick with something foul, the scent of rot and decay wafting up from the depths of the cave. His skin prickled as he heard something faint, distant but unmistakable, the scraping of claws against stone. He froze. The Wendigo. It was down here with him. The panic set in harder now, and despite the pain in his leg, Aiden forced himself to move. He had no idea which way to go, but he knew he couldn't stay where he was. The Wendigo would find him in no time if he did. His hand touched the wall beside him, searching for something, anything, that could give him a clue about how to escape. His fingers brushed over something cold and smooth, a metal ring. He grabbed it immediately, yanking it out of the wall with a harsh jerk. The sound of scraping metal echoed in the cave, and he winced, his heart pounding. The ring was attached to a rusted iron chain, which he followed down into the darkness. He pulled harder, his muscles straining, and the chain loosened, revealing a hidden door. A passage. He didn't hesitate. He crawled forward, ignoring the sharp pain in his leg, and entered the passage with trembling hands. The door closed behind him with a creak, leaving him in complete darkness. His breath came fast and shallow, and he forced himself to calm down. The air was damp and stale here, but it didn't smell like the death and decay of the cave. This was different, almost ancient. The stone walls felt too smooth, too deliberate. Aiden strained his ears, listening for any signs of movement, but all he could hear was his own breath. He didn't know where this passage led, but it had to be better than staying where he was. His footfalls echoed against the narrow stone corridor as he limped deeper, every instinct telling him to move faster. The cold air that rushed through the passage was thick with the promise of something else, something sinister. It felt as though the walls were closing in around him, the darkness pressing down like a weight. He rounded a corner and nearly collided with a wall of stone. His hands shot out to steady himself, and that's when he felt it. A soft, almost imperceptible vibration. The floor beneath his feet thrummed gently, as if something heavy was moving underneath the earth. Aiden froze, his heart thundering in his chest. He had been so focused on the Wendigo's pursuit that he hadn't thought about what else might be down here with him. Could there be other creatures? Traps? He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see glowing eyes in the dark. Nothing, but the vibration didn't stop. It was growing stronger, more pronounced. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry, and continued down the passage with more caution now. Every step a reminder that he was not alone in this place. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thickening with each passing moment. He had no idea how far the passage stretched, but it felt endless. Just when he thought he might collapse from exhaustion, he saw something ahead, a faint glimmer of light. His heart skipped a beat. Hope. Aiden quickened his pace, pushing through the pain in his leg. The light ahead was small, but it was real. He could see it more clearly now, flickering from the end of the tunnel. A torch, or something like it. He stumbled forward, but as he drew closer, the light shifted. It wasn't a torch. It was something else. The light flickered and died, and Aiden found himself plunged into total darkness once again. The pulse of the earth beneath him grew stronger now, thudding like the heartbeat of some monstrous thing. And then he heard it. A voice. Low, rasping, unclear. It wasn't speaking to him. It was speaking to something else. The Wendigo. Aiden's breath caught in his throat. The beast was near, and it was not alone. He had to keep moving. But as he took another step forward, something shifted in the shadows. The glow returned, this time brighter. But it wasn't a torch, a flame, or any kind of light Aiden had ever seen. It was a pair of eyes, glowing, burning, and they were staring right at him. Aiden's heart stopped. His breath caught in his throat as the glowing eyes stared at him from the pitch-black darkness. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, the instinctive dread clawing at his chest. There was something inhuman about those eyes, something so cold, so primal, that it made his stomach churn. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Time slowed, and Aiden was paralyzed. The only thing he could hear was the rapid thudding of his heart, the desperate drumbeat of his fear. He tried to look away, to move, but his legs refused to obey. His body was screaming at him to run, but all he could do was stare at the eyes that glowed brighter with each passing second. Then, in a sudden, terrifying shift, the eyes moved closer. Aiden staggered back, his body finally reacting. He spun on his heels, heart racing as he scrambled to flee. But before he could take more than a few steps, the ground beneath him trembled. The pulse of the earth grew stronger, the vibration so intense it made his teeth rattle in his skull. It felt like the very walls of the tunnel were closing in on him. A low, guttural growl echoed through the passage, sending a jolt of fear through Aiden's veins. He wasn't alone. Not in this tunnel. Not in this cave. The Wendigo was near, and it was getting closer. Aiden forced himself to run, the pain in his leg flaring up with every step, but he pushed through. His legs carried him down the winding tunnel, and the eerie vibrations grew more intense with each passing moment. The growls behind him sounded like they were closing in, louder, deeper, and more menacing. He could feel its presence, could almost hear its breath, slow and deliberate, following him in the dark. His pulse quickened, his mind racing as he looked desperately for an escape. The narrow passage seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the darkness swallowing him whole. And then, as though mocking him, the ground shook violently again, sending him crashing to the floor. Aiden gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stand once more. He had to keep going. There had to be a way out. And then he saw it. At the far end of the tunnel, a faint light flickered, barely visible in the thick darkness. It was a weak, fragile thing, but it was enough to give him hope. His eyes locked on it, the only thing in this nightmare that seemed real, that seemed possible. A way out. With renewed urgency, he pushed forward, his body screaming for rest but ignoring the pain. The closer he got to the light, the more it seemed to grow brighter, stronger, as though it were alive. He didn't care what it was. All that mattered was reaching it, escaping the relentless terror that pursued him. As he neared the light, he felt a sudden chill. A draft of cold air brushed past him, and the ground seemed to shudder once more. But this time, it wasn't the vibration of the Wendigo. It was something different. The air grew heavy, thick with something unnatural. Aiden's eyes darted around, searching for the source of the strange sensation. And that's when he saw it. A shadow, tall, thin, twisted. It was standing just beyond the light, lurking in the space between the tunnel and the unknown. The shape was grotesque, its outline flickering in and out of existence like a mirage. Aiden's blood ran cold as he took in the creature's form. Its limbs elongated, its body twisted in unnatural angles. Its face was a distortion, half human, half monster, with eyes that burned like hot coals. The Wendigo. Aiden froze. It was everything the legends had warned him about and more. But there was something else, something far worse than he could have imagined. As the Wendigo stepped forward, the air around it seemed to warp, distorting the world like a nightmare made real. Aiden had no choice. He had to keep moving. He forced his legs to carry him, to push forward through the suffocating terror that gripped his chest. But the moment he took another step, the creature moved as well, its movements jerky and unsettling, like a marionette controlled by an unseen force. Aiden's mind raced. There was no way he could outrun it. No way to escape the hunger in its eyes. The Wendigo was relentless. It was made of hunger and greed, and it wouldn't stop until it had consumed him. But then, as if answering his desperate thoughts, the light ahead flickered again. The shape in the shadows paused, its head tilting in a grotesque motion. The Wendigo seemed confused for a moment, hesitant. Aiden's chance. Without thinking, Aiden darted toward the light, his legs burning with the effort. The cold air nipped at his skin, but he didn't dare stop. He could hear the Wendigo's growl, low and furious, behind him as it began to move again, faster now. It wasn't far behind, but the light was within reach. With one final burst of energy, Aiden leapt into the light. For a brief, surreal moment, everything was silent. The growls of the Wendigo faded, and the oppressive darkness of the tunnel seemed to melt away. Aiden closed his eyes, gasping for air, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. But as his eyes fluttered open, he realized he had made a grave mistake. He was no longer in the tunnel. The light had brought him somewhere else, somewhere worse. He stood in the middle of a clearing, surrounded by trees that were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath his feet was soft, but it felt wrong, like something ancient, something evil had seeped into the earth itself. And then he saw it. The Wendigo was there, standing just at the edge of the clearing, its eyes burning with hunger. It was watching him, waiting. But it wasn't the only thing waiting. From the shadows between the trees, others emerged. More creatures, more Wendigos, more nightmares. And now Aiden understood the truth. The Wendigo didn't just hunger for flesh. It hunted for souls. Aiden's breath came in shallow, frantic gasps. His heart was pounding so loudly, he could hear nothing else, drowning out the chilling whispers of the wind. The clearing before him had become a cage, a trap from which there was no escape. His eyes darted around, searching for any hint of an exit, any way out of this nightmare. But all he saw were the looming figures in the shadows. The Wendigo stood at the edge of the clearing, its monstrous form casting an elongated, grotesque shadow. But it wasn't alone. More of the creatures emerged from the darkness, their hungry eyes gleaming with an insatiable thirst. They moved like phantoms, their bodies unnatural, contorting in ways that should have been impossible. There were at least 6 of them now, each one more terrifying than the last. Aiden's chest tightened as he fought to keep his legs from giving way beneath him. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The hunger in their eyes was overwhelming. The sound of snapping branches and rustling leaves filled the air, but none of it compared to the horrifying silence that followed. He was completely surrounded. The Wendigos were circling him, drawing closer, their elongated limbs scraping against the earth as they moved with an eerie, unnatural grace. Their faces were twisted masks of madness, their skin pale and stretched tight over bones that seemed too large for their bodies. They wore the hollowed-out expressions of the dead, their eyes wild with hunger and rage. Aiden tried to run, his instincts screaming at him to move, to get away from the monsters that were closing in. He forced himself to turn, but before he could take a step, a low growl stopped him dead in his tracks. It was coming from behind him. He spun around to find one of the Wendigos much closer now, its skeletal hand reaching toward him. Its eyes gleamed with an insidious hunger, but there was something else behind the madness, something cruel and intelligent. The creature's lips parted, revealing sharp teeth that glinted in the dim light, and it let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a laugh, a sound that made Aiden's blood run cold. "Run," he whispered to himself, his voice hoarse with fear. "Just run." His legs moved before he could think, and he bolted toward the tree line, toward what he hoped might be a way out. He couldn't look back. He couldn't risk it. Every instinct in him screamed to escape, to get away from the Wendigos that were closing in. He pushed through the underbrush, his limbs burning with effort, his mind a chaotic mess of terror and desperation. But just as he thought he might have gained some distance, he heard a deafening roar. The ground beneath his feet trembled as though the earth itself were alive, shifting beneath him. His stomach churned, and a deep primal fear rooted him in place. Aiden turned and found himself staring into the eyes of another Wendigo, one so close it could almost reach out and touch him. The creature's eyes were hollow, its skin stretched tight over its bony frame, its lips pulled back into a wide grin that revealed teeth sharper than knives. Before Aiden could react, the Wendigo lunged at him. Its massive hand shot out, grabbing him by the arm with a force that almost shattered his bones. Aiden screamed, struggling against the grip, but it was no use. The creature's strength was far greater than anything he had ever imagined. "Let go!" Aiden screamed, panic surging through his veins. He tried to break free, but the creature was too strong, too fast. It pulled him toward its gaping maw, its eyes gleaming with a savage hunger. In a desperate bid for survival, Aiden lashed out, kicking and flailing, trying to land any blow that might loosen the creature's grip. His foot connected with the Wendigo's chest, but it barely registered. The creature let out a guttural growl, tightening its hold, and Aiden knew that if he didn't do something quickly, he was going to be devoured. His mind raced as the air grew cold and thick with the scent of decay. Then, in the chaos, he remembered something, the small knife his father had given him when he was younger. It wasn't much, but in this situation, it was all he had. With a quick movement, Aiden yanked the knife from his pocket and, with all his remaining strength, stabbed the Wendigo in the arm. The creature howled in pain, its grip loosening just long enough for Aiden to break free. His heart raced as he fell to the ground, scrambling away from the creature. But the Wendigo wasn't finished. It let out a terrible screech that made Aiden's teeth rattle, and before he could react, the creature lunged at him again, its claws aimed straight for his throat. Just as it reached him, something unexpected happened. A loud crash sounded from the edge of the clearing, and Aiden saw a flash of movement. A new figure entered the clearing, a man, wild-eyed and ragged, covered in dirt and blood. He wielded a large axe, swinging it with a savage fury. The Wendigo hesitated for a split second, confused by the sudden interruption. That was all Aiden needed. Without thinking, he grabbed the axe from the stranger's hands and swung it with all his might at the creature's head. The blade struck with a sickening thud, cutting deep into the Wendigo's skull. It let out a horrid screech, collapsing to the ground in a heap of twitching limbs and twisted flesh. Aiden stumbled back, panting and covered in the creature's blood. His eyes flickered over to the stranger who had saved him, his breath ragged. The man stood tall, his face set in grim determination. His eyes were bloodshot, and his clothes were torn, but there was something about him, something strange. Aiden's gaze narrowed, unsure if he could trust this new ally, but the man wasn't looking at him. He was watching the other Wendigos that were slowly encircling them, sensing the danger still closing in. "We need to move," the man growled, his voice low and guttural. "They're not finished yet." Aiden didn't hesitate. He nodded, gripping the axe tightly. But as they turned to leave, the growl of the Wendigos grew louder, and the ground beneath their feet began to shake once more. Aiden looked over his shoulder to find that the Wendigos were not alone. From the shadows of the trees, something even worse was emerging. something darker, something older. And in that moment, Aiden realized the real nightmare had just begun. Aiden's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to face the woods. His breath came in ragged bursts, his every nerve screaming in warning. The stranger, still gripping his axe, stood beside him, his face a mask of grim determination. "We need to move now," the man said, his voice hoarse but urgent. "They're getting closer." Aiden barely had time to comprehend what was happening before the trees behind them shook. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from the darkness, growing louder by the second. Aiden's instincts screamed at him to run, to flee as fast as his legs could carry him. But the Wendigos had already circled them. He could hear their footsteps, heavy, like the crushing of bones beneath monstrous feet. The ground trembled beneath his feet, as if the earth itself was responding to the creature's hunger. Without a word, the man grabbed Aiden's arm and yanked him forward, pulling him deeper into the woods, away from the clearing. Aiden stumbled, his legs weak, but he didn't resist. The fear gripping him was so strong it drowned out every rational thought. Every instinct told him to keep running. But from the corner of his eye, he saw the Wendigos approaching at an alarming speed. Their eyes gleamed in the dark, hungry and cold, like the abyss itself. They weren't going to stop until they had him. The stranger led them deeper into the forest, moving with a speed and confidence that Aiden envied. His mind raced as he tried to catch his breath, his chest tight with fear. He couldn't understand it. He had thought the Wendigos were supposed to be a myth, some twisted folklore passed down through generations. But there was nothing mythical about the creatures pursuing him now. "How much farther?" Aiden gasped, his voice strained with panic. "We're almost there," the man replied, his eyes scanning the trees ahead, never slowing his pace. "But they're faster than you think." Aiden didn't know if the man was reassuring him or simply speaking the truth. Either way, it didn't matter. They were both being hunted. The Wendigos were relentless, their hunger unending. He had seen it in their eyes. They didn't just want to kill, they wanted to consume, to devour him whole. They ran for what seemed like hours, weaving through the thick underbrush, jumping over fallen trees, trying to stay ahead of the creatures that were growing ever closer. Aiden's legs burned with exhaustion, but there was no time to slow down. The man's grip on his arm tightened with every step, urging him to keep moving. They could hear the Wendigos now, closer, much closer. Then, just as hope seemed to be slipping away, they emerged from the woods into a clearing. Aiden's eyes widened in disbelief. Before them stood an ancient, crumbling stone structure, a ruin hidden deep in the wilderness. Its jagged silhouette loomed against the dark sky, the stones cracked and worn by time. It was like something out of a nightmare, a place that should not exist, and yet, there it was. The stranger didn't hesitate. He pushed Aiden toward the entrance, a dark archway leading into the heart of the ruin. Inside, he urged, "Now!" Aiden didn't question him. He ran into the darkened space, the chill of the stone walls wrapping around him like a suffocating embrace. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the only sound was the soft, distant echo of their footsteps. The man slammed the heavy door behind them, sealing them inside the ruin. Aiden's heart raced as he pressed his back against the cold stone wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. They were safe for now, but for how long? "What is this place?" Aiden asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The stranger, who had been pacing the room, stopped and turned to face him. His face was drawn, weary, but there was an intensity in his eyes that told Aiden this was not the first time he had encountered the Wendigos. "A place of refuge," the man replied, his voice dark with grim knowledge. "Or it was once." Aiden didn't understand. "What do you mean?" Why are we safe here? The man ran a hand through his hair, his expression one of frustration. This place was built long ago by those who knew about the Wendigos. It's a barrier of sorts, a place where they can't cross. Aiden frowned, his mind racing. You're telling me this ruin can keep them out? The man nodded. For now, but it won't last forever. The Wendigos are not like other creatures. They are born from hunger, from greed. And once they get a taste of you, they will stop at nothing to get you again. Aiden felt a cold chill spread down his spine. Why are they hunting me? The man's eyes narrowed, and he seemed to hesitate for a moment before speaking. Because you're the one they've been waiting for. Aiden felt a knot tighten in his stomach. What do you mean? I don't understand. The man sighed heavily. You don't know, do you? You don't know what's happened in this forest. The Wendigos, they're not just mindless beasts. They are the result of something far worse. The hunger they feel is not just for flesh. It's for the souls of those who wander here. And you, Aiden, have been chosen. Chosen? Aiden echoed, his voice trembling. Chosen for what? The man looked away, as if haunted by something from his own past. Chosen to be their next victim. You are the catalyst. The hunger of the Wendigos grows with each passing year, and once it reaches a certain point, it will consume everything. Everything. Aiden felt a chill run down his spine. How do you know all of this? The man's face hardened. I've been hunting these creatures for years. I've seen what they do to people. I've seen how they break them. But this is different. You've triggered something. You've made the Wendigo stronger. Aiden shook his head, trying to process what the man was saying. How do we stop them? How do we end this? The man was silent for a long moment, his eyes filled with an ancient sorrow. Then finally he spoke. We don't. Not by ourselves. But there's a way to weaken them. We have to find the heart of the forest. There's a place, deep within these woods, where the Wendigos were born. If we can reach it, we can destroy them. Aiden's heart sank. But how? The man took a deep breath. We need to find the source of their hunger. If we destroy it, we can destroy them. But it won't be easy. The Wendigos won't stop until they've consumed us, body and soul. Aiden felt the weight of the situation press down on him, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. What do we do now? The stranger's face hardened with determination. We fight, but we need to move quickly. The Wendigos are already at the door, and when they come, they won't stop. Aiden knew the truth now. The Wendigos weren't just monsters. They were an unstoppable force of nature, and unless they could reach the heart of the forest, they would both be consumed. The stone walls of the ruin were oppressive, cold, and silent, as if they too were waiting for the inevitable. Aiden stood beside the stranger, his breath shallow and panicked. The reality of the situation was starting to set in. The Wendigos were out there, waiting for them to make a mistake, to slip up, to give them a reason to pounce. He glanced at the man, whose face was set in a grim expression of focus. We don't have much time, the stranger said, his voice low but steady. The Wendigos are already gathering outside. They'll be circling this place, trying to find a way in. Aiden felt the cold sweat trickle down his back as he tried to steady his nerves. What exactly do we need to do? How do we find the heart of the forest? How can we stop them? The stranger turned to face him. His eyes darkened with something akin to sorrow. We need to venture deeper into the forest. It's a place of ancient power, but it's also a place where few who enter come back. The Wendigos were born from it, and so we must go to the source. But be warned, the closer we get to the heart, the more dangerous it becomes. The Wendigos will know we're coming. Aiden swallowed hard, trying to quell the fear that gnawed at him. "But how will we find this place?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned and started walking toward the far side of the ruin. "We don't need to find it. It will find us." Aiden felt his pulse quicken. "What does that mean?" The man didn't turn around but continued walking. "It's an ancient place, tied to the Wendigo's hunger. The forest will guide us, but we have to survive long enough to reach it." Aiden's mind raced. Every step they took from here would bring them closer to the heart of darkness, closer to the Wendigos. The fear that had been a constant presence in his chest now seemed to overwhelm him. The creatures weren't just hunting them. They were a part of the forest itself, born from its darkness, its insatiable hunger. "Do you think we'll make it?" Aiden asked, his voice shaking slightly as he caught up with the stranger. The man looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I don't know, but we don't have a choice. The Wendigos are relentless, and they will not stop until they have consumed everything. This is the only chance we have." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. Aiden didn't respond. What could he say? They were heading toward an ancient, cursed place where the Wendigos were born, where every step could be their last. There was no guarantee they would survive this, but it was their only hope. The night outside the ruin was thick with shadows, and the air felt impossibly still. Every sound seemed magnified. A leaf rustling in the wind, the distant call of an owl, the crunch of their boots against the frozen earth. The forest around them felt alive, watching, waiting, and with each step, Aiden could feel it, an overwhelming sense of dread creeping over him. As they moved deeper into the woods, the trees grew denser, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. The ground beneath their feet became uneven, the path hidden by a thick blanket of snow. It was as if the forest itself had swallowed them whole, cloaking them in its darkness. Aiden tried to steady his breathing, his thoughts scattered. Every rustle in the trees made him flinch. The Wendigos were close, he could feel it. They were out there, waiting for any sign of weakness. And with each step they took, the hunger of the creatures seemed to grow, more insistent, more dangerous. "How much farther?" Aiden asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The stranger didn't answer immediately, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead of them. "We're getting closer, but we need to be careful. The Wendigos won't let us get too close without a fight." Aiden's throat went dry. The thought of facing those creatures again, of coming face to face with the horrors they represented, filled him with a deep, primal fear. But he had no choice. He had to follow the stranger, had to trust that there was something, anything, that could end this nightmare. Suddenly, there was a sound, a sharp crack from the trees behind them. Aiden froze. The stranger turned on his heel, his hand reaching for the axe at his side. His face was hard, but Aiden could see the tension in his posture. They weren't alone. Before either of them could react, the sound came again, a deep, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. Aiden's blood ran cold. "It's them," the stranger muttered, his voice tight. "Stay close. Don't make a sound." Aiden's heart hammered in his chest. The Wendigos were here. The growl grew louder, closer, and then, from the darkness between the trees, they appeared. Aiden's eyes widened in horror as the Wendigos emerged from the shadows. Their bodies were tall and gaunt, their limbs twisted and unnatural, as though they had been broken and reshaped by some malevolent force. Their skin was a sickly, mottled gray, stretched taut over their bones, and their eyes glowed with an unnatural hunger, a ferocity that made Aiden's stomach churn. The creatures didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence was enough to send a wave of terror crashing over Aiden. He could feel the weight of their hunger, the desperation in their movements as they closed in on him, as if they were starved, not just for food but for something deeper, something more primal. Aiden didn't know what to do. The stranger had said the Wendigos could be killed, but how could he fight something so powerful, so unyielding? The man beside him stepped forward, his axe raised, his body tensed for action. "Stay back," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I'll take care of them. Just get to the heart of the forest. You have to get there. It's the only way." Before Aiden could protest, the stranger charged forward, his axe swinging with brutal precision. The Wendigos hissed, their claws scraping against the ground as they lunged at him. Aiden stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. But the growls behind him, the snapping of teeth, snapped him back to reality. He had to move. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. With one last glance at the man battling the Wendigos, Aiden turned and ran, his feet pounding the snow, his breath coming in gasps. Every instinct told him to stop, to look back, but he couldn't. The heart of the forest was out there, and he had no choice but to find it. Aiden ran blindly, the forest around him blurring into a swirl of shadows and snow. The Wendigos were close. He could hear them, feel them, smell their rancid, decaying presence in the air. The hunger was almost tangible. His body ached, but he pushed himself forward, deeper into the woods. He didn't know if the stranger was still alive, didn't know if he had a chance of surviving this, but he had to keep going. The heart of the forest was the only hope they had left. And somewhere, deep within the forest, he felt it. A dark pulse, a twisted heartbeat that called to him. Aiden didn't know if it was a warning or an invitation, but he followed it, unable to stop himself. The Wendigos were still out there, still hunting him, but now he was hunting something far worse. Aiden's breath came in ragged gasps as he sprinted through the endless forest, his legs burning with each step. The snow beneath his boots crunched with each desperate stride, but the sound was swallowed up by the eerie silence of the woods. The Wendigos were close now, too close. Their growls echoed through the trees like a nightmare come to life. He could feel the cold fingers of dread gripping his spine, tightening with each step. The forest around him seemed to close in, the trees narrowing, their gnarled branches reaching out like claws, trying to ensnare him. The wind howled through the barren trees, but Aiden barely noticed. His mind was consumed by the singular, overwhelming thought. He had to reach the heart of the forest. As he pushed forward, the sense of being watched, of being hunted, became almost unbearable. It wasn't just the Wendigos anymore. Something else was out there, something older, darker. The presence in the air was suffocating, pressing against his chest, making it harder to breathe. Aiden's mind raced with thoughts of the stranger, of the warnings he'd given him about the dangers ahead. He stumbled, his boot catching on a root, and fell to the ground with a thud. For a moment, he lay there, his breath coming in shallow bursts, his eyes darting around the dark forest. The sound of the Wendigos' growls was louder now, closer, but there was something else beneath it, a rhythmic pulsing sound, like a heartbeat. It wasn't the heartbeat of any living creature. It was something ancient, something that had been dead for far too long. Aiden's heart skipped a beat. The pulsing came from deep within the forest, from the very heart of the cursed land. He could feel it in his bones, a cold, magnetic pull drawing him forward. Every instinct screamed at him to run the other way, to escape the curse that was closing in around him. But he couldn't. The pull was too strong. He had to find it. He forced himself to his feet, wiping the snow from his face. The growls of the Wendigos were still too close for comfort, but the heartbeat, the pulse, was growing stronger. Aiden had no choice. He had to follow it. Hours seemed to pass as Aiden pushed deeper into the forest. The landscape had changed. The trees had grown twisted, their bark blackened and scarred, their leaves gone, replaced by sharp, thorn-like branches. The ground beneath him was slick with ice, and the air was thick with a heavy, suffocating fog. Aiden's mind was numb with fear, but the pulse kept him moving forward, its call impossible to ignore. His legs ached, his body was exhausted, but the strange force driving him onward gave him a burst of unnatural strength. He didn't understand why or how, but he had to reach the heart of the forest. The Wendigos were still out there, but something told him that if he got to the heart, if he found whatever it was that lay there, he might finally be able to end this nightmare. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees parted, revealing a clearing ahead. Aiden's breath caught in his throat. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, ancient stone structure, a dark temple that seemed to rise from the earth itself. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. A twisted, jagged thing, its surface covered in symbols and markings that seemed to shift in the dim light. The air around it was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the pulse, that horrible, rhythmic heartbeat, was deafening now. Aiden stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know why, but he felt an undeniable sense of dread as he approached the temple. The closer he got, the stronger the pulse became, and the more he could feel it. A gnawing hunger, an ancient force that had been sleeping for centuries, now awakening. He stopped just outside the entrance, his breath fogging in the cold air. The door to the temple was massive, covered in strange, twisting patterns. The markings seemed to writhe and squirm as if they were alive. Aiden's hand shook as he reached out to touch the cold stone. The moment his fingers made contact, a voice, low and guttural, whispered in his ear, "You should not be here." Aiden's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't the wind or his own mind playing tricks. It was something else, something older, something dark. He pulled his hand away, his heart racing. "What is this place?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "What's inside?" For a moment, there was nothing. Then, the voice spoke again, louder this time and much clearer. "A place of hunger, place of death. You should leave." But Aiden didn't move. The pulse, the heartbeat, was too strong now, calling to him, compelling him to step inside. He didn't know why, but he had to. He had to find whatever lay inside the temple, even if it meant facing whatever dark force had been waiting for centuries. With a deep breath, he pushed the heavy stone door open, the ancient hinges groaning in protest. The moment the door cracked open, the pulse seemed to explode in his chest, deafening, all-consuming. Aiden stepped inside. The inside of the temple was even darker than the forest outside. The air was thick with the smell of rot and decay, the walls slick with moisture. Strange, twisted statues lined the walls, creatures that seemed to be half human, half animal. Their eyes hollow and empty, their mouths open in eternal screams. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, the remnants of centuries of abandonment. But what caught Aiden's attention was the massive stone altar in the center of the room. It was bathed in an eerie, unnatural light, and it pulsed with the same rhythmic heartbeat that had been guiding him. On top of the altar lay a figure, a body or what was left of one. It was skeletal, its skin stretched tight over its bones, its eyes wide open in a permanent expression of horror. Aiden felt a chill crawl up his spine. The pulse was coming from this figure, and it was stronger than ever. But there was something else, something that made Aiden's stomach turn. The Wendigos were here. From the darkness at the edges of the room, the creatures began to emerge, their twisted, hungry forms moving toward him. Their eyes glowed with an insatiable hunger, their claws scraping the stone floor as they approached. Aiden's heart hammered in his chest, and his legs felt weak, as though he might collapse any moment. And then, from behind him, a voice called out, No, it's too late. Aiden spun around, his pulse racing. The stranger, the man who had led him here, stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "They're already here," the stranger whispered, his voice barely audible over the growls of the Wendigos. "You've opened the door, and now we're all doomed," the Wendigos growled, their unnatural hunger echoing through the cold stone walls of the temple. Aiden's heart raced as their glowing eyes locked onto him, their monstrous forms prowling closer, clawed feet scraping the dust-covered floor. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to run, but the strange pull of the altar, that relentless pulse, held him captive. The air was thick with dread, suffocating, as though the very walls of the temple were closing in. The stranger, pale and trembling, took a step backward, his hands stretched out in a feeble attempt to ward off the creatures. "You shouldn't have come," he whispered hoarsely, his voice breaking. "This place, it feeds on the living. Never lets go." Aiden's breath caught in his throat. "What is this place? What is that thing on the altar?" he demanded, his voice a mixture of fear and anger. He couldn't understand. Why had he been led here? Why had he ignored every warning? The stranger's eyes darted to the altar. "That's it," he said, his voice trembling. "The Wendigo is born from starvation. But this is something worse. It's an ancient curse, a hunger that never dies. You've opened the door, and now you're its feast." Aiden's mind spun. The Wendigos, the pulse, the darkness. Everything was coming together now, but it made no sense. "I don't understand," he muttered, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a heavy stone. "How do I stop it?" The stranger shook his head. "There's no stopping it. It's too late. The hunger is in you now. It's in all of us. The only way out is to give in." The Wendigo's growls grew louder as they moved closer, their grotesque bodies shifting in the dim light. They were almost upon him. Aiden's body froze, caught in the grip of terror. But then, the strange pull of the altar. No, it wasn't just the altar, he realized it was him. The hunger, the call, it was in his own chest now. The beat of the pulse was his own heart, racing, desperate, thrumming with the promise of something terrible, something impossible to resist. Without thinking, he reached for the altar, his fingers brushing against the cold, smooth stone. The moment he touched it, a flood of images overwhelmed him, visions of the past, of people, of screams, of endless hunger. The Wendigo's curse was not just a creature. It was a force, an insatiable hunger that had been passed down through generations, a cycle of greed, of consumption, of death. The pulse grew louder in his ears, and with it, the overwhelming need to feed, to devour. His mouth went dry, and his body trembled. He could feel the Wendigo's hunger merging with his own, their cold, ravenous desire creeping into his very soul. "You can't fight it." The stranger's voice was barely a whisper now, drowned out by the growing cacophony of gnashing teeth and shrill howls. "You've already become one of them." Aiden stepped back, his head spinning. He looked around at the Wendigos, their eyes glowing with an all-consuming hunger. They weren't just hunting him, they were feeding on his fear, on the terror that filled his every fiber. And deep down, in the dark recesses of his mind, Aiden knew the terrible truth. There was no escape. The Wendigos surged forward, their claws slashing through the air. Aiden couldn't move. His body was frozen, caught between the pull of the hunger and the fear that bound him. But then the stranger moved. In a final, desperate act, the man lunged at the altar, his hands reaching for the stone. His body seemed to convulse as the pulse surged through him, and his eyes widened with agony. "No," he screamed. "This is the end." The Wendigo stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The growls faded, replaced by a deep, bone-chilling silence. And then, the stranger's body twisted violently, his limbs elongating, his flesh contorting as he was consumed by the curse. His form twisted into something grotesque, his body becoming one with the creatures around him. A Wendigo. Aiden stared in horror, unable to move. The stranger, the man who had tried to warn him, had become one of them. The Wendigos, now silent, began to circle him. Their eyes glowed brighter, the hunger in them more pronounced, more intense. Aiden could feel it, the deep, gnawing hunger that had always been there, buried in the darkness of the world. But now it was rising, it was within him. As the Wendigos closed in, Aiden's heart pounded in his chest, the beat of the pulse becoming deafening, consuming him. The hunger was no longer just an external force, it was him. He was the Wendigo. The last thing Aiden saw was the stone altar, bathed in the eerie light of the pulse. And then, everything went black.